Are you ready to get intimate? What is intimacy? And where and how do you find it? Welcome to the Getting Intimate podcast, a daring journey into the heart of intimacy with you, your senses, the whole world, and all the creatures in it. Intimacy can be a pretty wild ride, filled with both longing and apprehension. But what if the vulnerability of intimacy isn't something to be avoided, but celebrated? What if getting intimate is the key to finally coming alive? Discover more with guests from all walks of life and your host, Katarina Valentin. Welcome to this new episode of the Getting Intimate podcast. And this time we're exploring intimacy with our voices, the way we show up in the world and are heard in the world. And as our guide, I've invited Chris Hughes. And Chris Hughes is, according to himself, a charlatan, a hedonist, keen to celebrate sex and kindness and beauty and instigate change for a different world. He also medals as a communications mentor, opera singer, arts and antiques curator, and a right voice for you facilitator. So basically, perfectly suited to take us on this journey. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Katarina. It's my evening here in Brisbane and your morning in Sweden. I assume you're in Sweden?
Yes, I am. I'm in my little house in Sweden, and it is early summer. So it's like I'm infatuated with nature. I want to go on the grass. I want to look at the flowers. I want to go out in the forest. I want to listen to all the birds singing. There are so many squirrels this year, and they keep running over my garden. And I'm like sitting watching squirrels. That in itself sounds funny. So if we go to your voice, which you already started to express, obviously, in this podcast, there's so many ways you can have a voice. You can have a singing voice, and you can also have, I like to ask you a bit more about what it actually means to have a voice, but also when you express yourself, you have a voice. And you have a way with words, English, that is brilliant, like the way you say things. And you also have like a vibration to your speaking voice that pulls people in, like a capacity to get people's attention and actually get them to stop for a little bit and just like listen. So if you would talk about what having a voice means, what is that?
Well, the fact that we have a voice that comes out of our bodies at all is, according to some scientists, an accident. There is no reason for us to have a voice necessarily. Like the larynx, where the voice is produced, it's these folds of muscles that flap together as we inhale and exhale. And their only actual purpose, according to science, is to keep food out of our lungs. That's the only reason why they're really there. But as that sound comes out of our larynx and is channeled through our head, it comes out of us as this thing that we call voice. And I think our voice, similar to like aspects of culture, like you're in Sweden and I'm in Australia, we have certain ways of composing ourselves. We have different cuisines. We have different languages. We have a number of ways that we sort of just be in the world and relate to each other. I think that all is part of voice as well, like who we are and how we present ourselves. Like, yes, we have a physical voice, this sound that comes out, but I've always felt that your speaking voice, and similarly, like just how you engage with the world, there's a potential for it to be an art form, and you articulate yourself in this way that shows everybody not only who you are, but what you see could be as a way of living. Throughout history, we've had people famous for their wit and their style. People like Diana Vreeland, who was the director of Vogue magazine before Anna Wintour for a long time, and she's a really fabulous character. Well, she was. She's dead now. Oscar Wilde, Quentin Crisp, Tallulah Bankhead, all these people that had this like panache and style and wit and articulation about them, where they had this sense of who they were that is so different, and they enjoyed who they were, and so they gave that to the world in such a way that was quite generous, is what I would say.
And you sometimes talk about our lives being like an expression of our being, a voice for our being, which is kind of what you're referring to here. And in this podcast, we talked a lot about the 5 elements of intimacy. So when you listen to people speaking in your classes or just in the world, what do you hear? Like, what do you perceive when it comes to how they're willing to be the expression of their being, or how they're willing to show up?
I'm glad you mentioned those 5 elements of intimacy, because there's something that I have insisted on being in the Right Voice for You manual for a long time. If you were to like take those 5 elements of intimacy, the gratitude, the allowance, the trust, the vulnerability, and the honor. Another way of saying that is actually liking who you are. Like knowing who you are, receiving who you are, being vulnerable with who you are, and coming to know you and like you, so that you give up the pretense, and you give up the proving, and you give up the investment in anyone else's approval. And so you start to share who you actually are with the world, and that's your voice. So that is so much of what we talk about. They all come looking for a technique. And I'm the anti-technique. I strip it all away and say, no, we want to see you. We want to see what you're trying to hide. We want to see you warts and all. We want to see your soft belly that you're trying to hide. That's the part of you that people will fall in love with. Gary Douglas, our dear friend and founder of Access Consciousness, reminded me recently when we were in Prague. I was having lunch with him during the Right Voice for You facilitator class. And he summed this up so beautifully by saying, when you have no judgment of yourself, people fall in love with you and they have no bloody clue why.
Yeah.
There's just something about you.
There is also a tremendous power with voice. And as I was preparing for this podcast, I was like, things about voices kept popping up. And 2 things that strangely popped up was in Lord of the Rings, Saruman, the wizard, he has this like very magical, very manipulative voice where he can get anybody to believe that he is the best and goodest wizard of them all. And then you have in Dune, they have that power, the voice, where they can just say something and everybody has to do, what they tell them. So could you kind of like translate that into our reality and talk about people who use their voice for power and what that is and what that creates?
Yes. And thank you for that question. Have you ever read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah. Long time ago, though, I must admit.
Mark Twain, great American novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Yeah. I have a funny relationship with that book. See, when I was a wee lad, every Sunday night we would go for dinner at my grandmother and grandfather's house. And my grandmother is a fabulous cook. And my grandfather could tell a story like no one I've ever met. That man, he was a salesman, okay? He retired in March. And for that year, January to December, he still sold more cars in 3 months than anybody else in the whole firm. He could tell stories. And so we'd go for Sunday dinner. And after eating, Grandma would be getting dessert ready. And we would just sit at the table and Grandpa would start spinning a yarn and telling us a story. And we would sit there just wrapped in his attention. And then later, I got a little older and I read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and realized he stole every one of those stories. He had told these tales as though he'd had the most interesting life. And then I realized none of this was about you.
Oh, that's so wonderful.
But I used that story, and I used one of the stories from in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn to talk about exactly what you just said. Because I didn't talk so much about Saruman, but I've talked a lot about Dune and Frank Herbert's Dune, how the Bene Gesserit have this capacity called the voice. And when they use the voice to manipulate people and get them to do what they want, there's this like force behind it, or that's how it's depicted. It's like, rah! And they command people and they go, oh. But I see that same ability to spin a yarn and tell a tale and get people on your side. And even the other English expression we use is lead people down the garden path. I
Yes.
see that in Mark Twain, and I see that in all of us if we choose it. The ability, because Gary Douglas, he said to me, because I'm the chief facilitator, whatever you want to call it, for Right Voice. I facilitate the facilitators and license them every year. And a couple years ago, he said, you need everyone to read Dune by Frank Herbert and get them to look at the voice. And I was like, okay. And it was one of those things where for the first year and a half, it didn't make any sense to me. It was like,
Right.
really? Are we supposed to harness this power where we'll like shout at people and make them do things? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you have it. And I said, I do? How? He said, well, can you talk anyone into anything? And I went, yeah. And he said, can you get everyone on side and get them to like you? I went, yeah. I said, that's the voice.
Yeah.
He said, how it's depicted in science fiction and fantasy is one thing, but we all have this capacity, this gift of the gab, we call it in English, to engage with people and talk to them and get them on board with whatever it is you want to get them on board with. Like my favorite story from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, I keep glancing up because it's staring at me on my bookshelf, is young Huckleberry Finn goes to stay with his aunt for the summer. And he's so excited about going to stay with her in the country because he can go swimming and he can go through the forest and he can go play with his friends and ride his bike all day. And she says, no, young man, you got to paint the fence. And he goes, oh. So he's outside and he's painting the fence, and along comes his friend. And his friend says, hey, Huck, what are you doing? And he says, oh my God, you would not believe it. Oh, wow. I am the luckiest boy on the planet. I get this summer to paint this whole fence. Can you believe that? I've been looking forward to this for the last 6 months. I just couldn't wait to paint this fence. And his friend says, oh, well, what about, I want to paint the fence. Can I paint the fence? And Huck says, look, I've really been looking forward to this. I'm not just going to give this job away. Well, what do you got? Like, we could trade something? And his friend says, well, I've got candy. You can have my candy. And Huckleberry says, yeah, that's a start. But I mean, candy will be gone in an afternoon. And then you'll still be paying the fence and I'll have nothing. His friend says, well, you can take my bicycle. And he goes, okay, that's cool. That would help me get to the river. What else? Well, I've got money. I've got money to buy lunch. And Huckleberry says, okay, if I can have the candy, the bicycle, and your lunch money, we've got a deal. And that is the voice.
Yes.
Like we all know somebody with that kind of charisma, with that kind of ability to glamour people into doing things. Like, and that's what they used to call it in any of the stories about vampires. A vampire could glamour you into
Very
doing
true.
things. There still is a negative connotation, though, right? There's this negative association that if you're doing that to people, you're manipulating them for ill will and evil. That's a bigger conversation for another time. But I see the capacity for the voice being to empower people to get over what they think is wrong with them.
And I love how you such a good story, by the way. I had forgotten that story. And I do remember it from the book. But the way you tell it, your whole body is engaged. Your whole, like, your face changes, like your eyebrow lifts, your hands move. So this actually brings me, like, it goes with the voice too. And it brings me to something that I wanted to ask you about. So I sometimes look at the world and I'm like, if people would just communicate, things would be so much easier. And then I was like, but what if it's not about communication? What if it's about engagement, like how we engage? So could you talk about the difference between communication and engagement?
Yeah, for sure. As you said, when I told the story, there's a level of engagement and aliveness that occurs. That's an art that we're losing. See,
Yeah.
you want to go back even further historically, before electricity, even as cave people, all we had, and I'm no anthropologist, but here I'm telling you anyway. All we had to entertain each other was our ability to tell stories and sit around fires at night and relate to each other what we'd seen during the day, etc. Well, that evolved right into the dining table, and we would sit around the dining table, and that dining table became the fire. And if you're like me, we weren't allowed phones and devices at the dining table, and we had to actually talk to each other and be able to tell a story or tell a joke or relate what had happened during the day. But now people more than ever they don't know how anymore to tell a good story and engage with one another. I see engagement as this much more broadly than that. Engagement to me is being present and receiving everything with no barrier whatsoever. But that's only 50% of the game. Being there and being present is what most people actually do. And it's why so many people, I think, are disassociating and shutting off, because they're overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with the intensity of judgment that they're present for. Like in Andy Warhol's autobiography, he put it so succinctly. He talked about the fact that he'd been everywhere and he'd seen everything, but he was never a part of any of it. And that's how I think most people today live. They've been everywhere, they've seen everything, but they weren't really there. They weren't all that. So to me, the gap that needs to be bridged is not just being there, being present and receiving everything, but actually grabbing a glove and getting in the game, being a part and including yourself in the world around you as well, so that you're not sitting at a table and feel like no one can hear you, no one can see you, and you're being talked over. Actually taking your seat at the table and being there, which also requires your voice.
Well, it's it's when you were describing it in the beginning, it's like when you were talking, it's like you actually, as you're talking, are also listening if you're engaging, and the opposite way around. So it's like a simultaneity of talking, listening, of gifting and receiving. And it so reminds me, there's another movie where the voice is so important. It's out of Africa. Karen Blixen, I think she's called that in the movie too, but one of the things she does is to tell stories. It's one of her, talents. And as she tells the stories, she pulls people into the stories. She gets them to give her little clues of where to go next. Like, so the storytelling becomes this like group effort in a way. And it's so beautiful. Every time I watch it, I'm like, that's where everybody is present and everybody is enjoying this like adventure that the story takes us on, which is engaging, like you're saying, being present for what unfolds, because she makes the stories up. So nobody knows where it's going to go after the next clue. If you haven't seen it, you have to watch it.
I have seen it, but a long time ago.
It's a beautiful little part of the movie where you
Meryl
get a
Streep.
sense of, and Meryl Streep plays Karen Blixen, yeah, and Robert Redford plays Dennis, who is the American ranger that she loves, and that she actually glamours in with the help of these stories. That's basically what happens.
Yeah. The Pied
But it's in. Sorry, go on.
the Pied Piper.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting how when you start talking about engagement, how much bigger the picture is. Now we're talking about the kind of lives we live, in this world where we're becoming observers, passive, like you're saying, passive observers of judgment instead of engaged and actually present and living, like
Mm.
living, fully living. So I wanted to ask you one more thing, and I know it's not totally, it may actually connect to engagement. What is stage fright? Why are people so afraid to talk in front of other people? Does it have to do with the judgment you were mentioning before when they were observing?
There's a couple things going on there. Do you know, Kat, that stage fright, quote unquote, is the number one fear on the planet?
Yeah. Yes, I know.
It is the biggest thing. Like, there's a great episode of Seinfeld where Jerry Seinfeld and Elaine are at a funeral, and they're sitting in the audience at the funeral, and they're watching this person go up to give the eulogy. And Elaine says to Jerry, she says, the number one fear on the planet is public speaking. And Jerry said, huh, so you mean more people would rather be in the coffin than up on stage speaking? And it's true. More
Yeah.
people would rather be dead than actually stand up and be heard. I think what it actually is, it may seem overly simplistic, and I don't think it's always this necessarily, but more often than not, it's actually excitement, because there's two things that are going on there. On one hand, there is the excitement of actually getting out of your shell and being seen and heard. There's that side of it. But also, one thing most people never give themselves is an opportunity to be received.
Mm,
See, as you said, we're so comfortable as observers. We'd rather sit in the anonymous mass of the audience and receive. But when you're up on stage, not only do you receive, but you are being received. And
yeah.
that scares most people. So I think it's excitement about that. And our bodies actually love that. Like, most
Mm,
people, anytime in a right voice class, we get people to do the activities and get up on stage and be seen and do things. Afterwards, their bodies are like, so happy, so relaxed, so nourished by the experience. I think, though, that in stage fright, though, there is a little bit of fear of what people think they're going to lose. We are so image obsessed at the moment in particular. We're so hyper vigilant about what everyone thinks, whether we're going to be canceled or rejected, and who we might possibly lose if we fuck up
mm,
and we say the wrong thing, or we do a bad job, or worst case scenario, we're entirely forgettable and mediocre. I get that's part of it too. But if you're actually being those 5 elements of intimacy you mentioned, it's not really a concern.
mm. And I really love what you mentioned there at the beginning, the kind of like the misidentification of fear and excitement, because it's so true. Anytime you work with people and you get them in front of the group, or you get them even just talk, like really sharing something that comes from the 5 elements of intimacy, from vulnerability and honoring, afterwards their body is like buzzing and they're alive. They're so alive because they've been received. They exist on the planet suddenly from that. So it's like we're actually cutting off one of the fuels for living by not, by this fear that we decided exists. Wow. So as we're going towards the end, how would you recommend that people start playing with their voice? If they're listening to this and maybe they do have fear of public speaking, or they don't really know where to begin to start getting this fuel into their life.
Well, couple things. First of all, your voice isn't you. There's something really weird about the voice where we've come to define ourselves by it. And so when you hear a recording of yourself, it's so confronting, and we have all these judgments come up, and it's like, oh, who's that awful person? It's sort of like seeing a photograph or a video of yourself. It brings up all of these judgments. Please know that what you hear and what everyone else hears are totally different things, first of all, because we're not listening to you through judgment. The second thing, and probably the most pragmatic tool that I would give everyone, is ask yourself this question. What's the worst thing that could happen? You go up and you screw up and you do a bad job. So what? It's like in those moments, like say, for example, you're at karaoke and suddenly the microphone's in your hand. Someone's written your name on the list and sent you up without you knowing. And here you have an opportunity to either choose it and grab it and go and live a little and insert yourself in other people's worlds, or say no.
Yeah.
And if you say no, that's not wrong, but what would your life be like in 5, 10, 15, 25, 50 years if you just said yes to these opportunities and went, you know what? Fuck it. What's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah, that. Thank you so much for this conversation. And for any of you out there, what if you were willing to consider a yes if you're asked to engage with the world? And if they want to find you, where do they find you?
My address is Unit 1105, 140 Alice Street, Brisbane, Queensland.
And if they're not in Australia and would like to find you online, where do they go then?
Then you should go to www.mrchristopherhughes.com, and you can find out about all kinds of stuff there. Bye, everybody.